Harlem in the late 1960s breathed differently at night. The streets carried the weight of history in every crack of concrete, every flickering streetlight, every whispered name. Frank Lucas walked those blocks like a man who belonged to them. Not loudly, not arrogantly, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had survived long enough to earn respect. Before this story truly begins, let me pause for just a moment. We have a dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of this month. Subscribe, leave a like, and be part of this dream. Because stories like this were never meant to be forgotten, only retold by those willing to listen. Frank had seen police cars crawl through Harlem his entire life, slow and predatory, like sharks circling water they didn't own. He had been arrested, questioned, beaten, and released more times than he could count. Sometimes guilty, sometimes not, but always judged before a word was spoken. To the NYPD, Harlem wasn't a neighborhood. It was a hunting ground. And men like Frank Lucas were never seen as businessmen, strategists, or survivors, only targets waiting for a mistake. That night, 2 patrol cars rolled up on him outside a closed bar on 125th Street. The officers didn't rush. They didn't need to. They stepped out smiling, hands resting casually near their batons, eyes already filled with assumptions. One of them recognized Frank immediately. The other didn't, but it didn't matter. Recognition only changed the tone, not the outcome. Frank stayed calm, his hands visible, his voice controlled. Experience had taught him that fear only fed men like this. Then it happened. One officer leaned in close enough for Frank to smell cheap coffee and tobacco on his breath. His voice dropped, sharp and venomous, and he used the N-word like a weapon, slow, deliberate, meant to remind Frank exactly how small they thought he was. The street went quiet. Even the city seemed to hold its breath. Frank didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He simply looked at the man, and in that silence, something irreversible began. The officer expected anger, maybe fear, maybe a sudden move that would justify everything he already wanted to do. What he didn't expect was Frank Lucas to smile. Not wide, not mocking, just enough to signal control. Frank had learned long ago that rage was expensive. Silence, on the other hand, was currency. The other cop shifted uncomfortably, glancing up and down the street, aware of windows watching, of Harlem remembering. Even in the dark, neighborhoods like this never truly slept. Frank's mind moved faster than his body. He thought of Bumpy Johnson, standing tall in Italian suits, while white mobsters pretended they weren't terrified. He remembered the lessons Harlem taught its kings. Power wasn't volume, it was patience. The officer who spoke the slur leaned closer, emboldened by the lack of resistance. He thought silence meant weakness. That misunderstanding had ended many careers before him, though he didn't know it yet. "Watch your mouth," Frank said calmly, his voice steady, almost bored. The words landed heavier than a shout. The officer laughed and shoved him once, just enough to cross a line that never appeared in reports. That shove carried years of resentment, badges abused, nights where nobody would ever believe the truth. Frank stumbled half a step, then straightened. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for memory. Across the street, a man slipped back inside a bodega. Upstairs, a woman pulled her child away from the window. Harlem had seen this scene before, and it almost never ended well for men who looked like Frank. But this time felt different. The second officer finally intervened, not to stop the abuse, but to control it. "Let's move him," he said, "before this turns into paperwork." They cuffed Frank hard, metal biting into his wrists, not because he resisted, but because they could. As they pushed him toward the car, Frank caught his reflection in the patrol window. Older now, heavier with responsibility, but sharper than ever. He knew something they didn't. This wasn't a random stop. This wasn't just another night. By calling him that word, by touching him in front of witnesses, they had stepped into a story much bigger than themselves. And Harlem never forgot names, especially the names of men who thought they were untouchable. The precinct on West 126th Street smelled like bleach, sweat, and old lies. Frank Lucas had been inside enough police stations to know that each one had its own personality. This one was tired, but dangerous. The officers who brought him in didn't book him right away. That was the first sign. Instead, they left him cuffed to a bench in a side room, a place without cameras, without witnesses, without time. That room existed for one reason only: to remind men like Frank who held the power. Minutes stretched into something heavier. Frank listened to the building breathe, the distant ringing phones, boots on tile, muffled laughter down the hall. He thought of Vietnam, of bodies flown home in silence while politicians smiled on television. He thought of Harlem funerals, packed churches, open caskets, mothers screaming prayers that went unanswered. This system didn't need to kill you to win. It just needed you tired enough to give up. The same officer came back alone. His badge caught the fluorescent light as he leaned against the wall, studying Frank like a problem he wanted to solve with force. "You think you're important," he said. "All you people do." He used the word again, quieter this time, more intimate, like a secret meant to rot the soul. Frank felt anger rise, sharp and hot, but he buried it. Anger was what they wanted. Control was what scared them. Frank finally spoke, slow and deliberate. "You don't know who you're touching." The officer laughed and stepped forward, pressing a finger into Frank's chest. "I know exactly who you are." That was the lie. He knew rumors. He knew street talk. But he didn't understand structure, money, alliances. He didn't understand that Frank Lucas didn't survive Harlem by accident. Every move Frank made had ripples, and those ripples had teeth. Down the hall, a desk sergeant picked up the phone, his expression changing as a name was quietly repeated back to him. Frank didn't hear the call, but he felt the shift. Energy in the building changed, subtle, but real. Doors opened faster. Voices dropped. The officer in front of Frank hadn't noticed yet. He was still enjoying the moment. But moments like this never last. And when power realizes it miscalculated, it doesn't apologize, it panics. The panic didn't arrive loudly. It slipped in through silence. A sergeant stood too straight at his desk. A lieutenant reread a report that hadn't been written yet. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang and wasn't answered on the first ring. Frank Lucas noticed everything. Men who grew up invisible learned to read runes the way others read newspapers. Power always left fingerprints, especially when it realized it might have gone too far. The officer finally uncuffed Frank, not with an apology, but with irritation. "Sit tight," he muttered, suddenly aware of eyes on him. Frank rolled his wrists slowly, letting the blood return. He said nothing. Silence had done more damage in this building than any confession ever could. Through the glass, he watched the officer step into a heated conversation with a supervisor. Words like complaint, witnesses, and downtown floated through the air, clipped and urgent. Frank's thoughts drifted to the larger board. Harlem wasn't just streets. It was leverage. Ministers, business owners, union men, soldiers back from war who remembered who helped them when the government didn't. Frank had invested in people long before he invested in product. That was the mistake outsiders always made. They thought power lived in guns. It didn't. It lived in gratitude, memory, and obligation. A detective Frank recognized entered the room, older, careful, his eyes tired but alert. He closed the door behind him and studied Frank for a long moment. "This didn't need to happen," the detective said quietly. Frank met his gaze. "No," he replied, "but it did." The detective nodded, understanding the weight of those words. Systems didn't break because of accidents. They broke because someone believed the rules didn't apply to them. Outside, rain began tapping against the windows, light at first, then heavier. Harlem always seemed to rain when truth was close. The officers who had stopped Frank avoided eye contact now, busy with imaginary tasks. They felt it too, that sense that something had shifted. This wasn't about a man in cuffs anymore. This was about a department realizing it had created a problem that paperwork couldn't bury. Frank leaned back on the bench, calm as ever. He knew the next move wouldn't come from shouting or threats. It would come from consequences. And consequences, once set in motion, didn't ask permission. They arrived when they were ready. Frank was released without charges just after midnight, the kind of release that came with no paperwork and no explanations. A silent escort walked him to the door, as if sound itself might make things worse. Outside, the rain had washed the streets clean, leaving Harlem glossy under the streetlights. Frank paused at the steps of the precinct, breathing in the night air like a man stepping back into his own body. Freedom, he knew, was rarely permanent, but timing was everything. Word traveled faster than sirens ever could. By morning, shop owners were talking. By noon, barbershops were buzzing. By sunset, the story had grown teeth. Everyone knew Frank Lucas had been stopped. Everyone knew what was said. And everyone knew something had gone wrong for the cops, because Frank walked free. In Harlem, outcomes mattered more than explanations. And this outcome felt like a warning. At the precinct, the mood curdled. Internal Affairs asked questions framed like traps. Supervisors demanded timelines that didn't line up. Witnesses were suddenly easier to find than expected. A woman from an apartment across the street swore under oath she heard the slur. A Vietnam veteran claimed he saw the shove. None of them had ever trusted the police, but they trusted Harlem's memory more. One of the officers tried to laugh it off at a bar that night. He didn't finish his drink. Conversation stopped when he walked in. Eyes followed him, not with fear, with calculation. He felt it then, deep in his chest. This wasn't over. Not because of Frank alone, but because he had insulted something larger than a man. He had insulted a community that survived by remembering exactly who heard it. Frank sat in his living room, calm, composed, listening to the city breathe through his window. He didn't make calls. He didn't need to. The machinery was already moving, quiet, relentless, inevitable. Harlem didn't riot. Harlem documented. And once the truth was written down, even the most protected badges began to rust. Internal Affairs didn't come with sirens or raised voices. They came with folders, thick ones, worn at the edges, carrying years of complaints that had gone nowhere. Frank Lucas's name was just the spark. What followed was fuel that had been quietly accumulating for a long time. Stops without cause. Use of force reports that read like copies of each other. Witness statements dismissed as unreliable. Patterns that only became visible once someone finally bothered to look. The officer who had spoken the slur was called in first. He sat across from two men who didn't smile, didn't threaten, didn't rush. They asked him to explain his night, his wording, his decisions. He answered confidently at first, then defensively, then carefully. Each shift in tone was noted. Each contradiction circled in red. He didn't know it yet, but the interview wasn't about Frank Lucas anymore. It was about him. A second file landed on the table. Older, heavier. A complaint from 5 years earlier. Same officer. Same neighborhood. Same language. Partially blacked out, but unmistakable. Another complaint followed. Then another. None of them had stuck at the time. They didn't need to now. Together, they told a story that no amount of procedure could erase. Systems protected men like this. Until they couldn't. Frank watched the city respond the way it always did when truth surfaced. Calm on the outside, tense underneath. Ministers spoke carefully. Community leaders asked pointed questions. Reporters started calling, sniffing around without knowing exactly what they were chasing. Frank declined every request. Visibility was dangerous. Influence worked best from the shadows. Late one night, the detective who had spoken to Frank at the precinct stopped by his building. No badge on display this time. No threats. Just honesty. "This is bigger than I thought," he admitted. Frank nodded once. "It always is," he replied. What the officer had said that night wasn't just an insult. It was evidence. And evidence had a way of surviving even the strongest walls. Pressure doesn't announce itself. It tightens quietly, like a hand around the throat of an institution that's been breathing too freely for too long. The department issued statements filled with careful language. Isolated incident. Under review. No conclusion at this time. Promotions were frozen. Transfers were suggested. Lawyers appeared where supervisors once stood. The system wasn't admitting guilt. It was building walls. The officer felt it immediately. Friends stopped calling. Partners requested reassignment. A union rep advised him to keep his head down, which sounded less like strategy and more like surrender. He replayed the night in his head, over and over, trying to find the moment where he could have stopped himself. He told himself it was just a word. The city was telling him it wasn't. Frank Lucas moved through Harlem like nothing had changed. That was the most unsettling part for the men watching him. No bodyguards, no speeches, no interviews. He visited churches, paid hospital bills, showed up at funerals he had no obligation to attend. Every quiet appearance reminded the city who he was and who he wasn't. He wasn't begging for justice. He was allowing it to arrive on its own. Behind closed doors, the department debated containment. Sacrifice one to save the rest. Limit the scope. Redirect attention. But files have memories and witnesses have voices. The more they tried to narrow the damage, the wider it spread. A sergeant testified. A clerk produced logs. A recording surfaced, not of the slur itself, but of what came after: laughter, indifference, confidence. The sound of men who believed nothing would happen to them. Frank stood at his window that night, watching patrol cars pass without stopping. He understood the final truth better than most. Systems don't collapse when confronted by rage. They collapse when confronted by evidence, time, and their own reflection. And a reflection staring back at this one wasn't flattering. The consequences didn't arrive with handcuffs in front of cameras. They arrived the way real endings always do: quiet, irreversible, permanent. The officer resigned before termination papers could be finalized. Officially, it was a personal decision. Unofficially, it was survival. His partner was reassigned, then quietly pushed out months later when another complaint surfaced. No parade, no apology, just absence. In Harlem, absence spoke louder than confessions. The department closed the case with carefully worded conclusions, but the damage was already done. Policies were revisited. Training was updated. None of it erased what the community learned: that speaking out could work if enough people remembered together. The precinct went back to business, but something in its posture had changed. Patrol cars slowed for different reasons now. Voices stayed lower. Hands hesitated before shoves that once came easily. Frank Lucas never claimed victory. He never needed to. He continued doing what he had always done: operating within systems while understanding their weaknesses. When asked years later about that night, he only said, "Respect tells you who a man really is." For Frank, respect wasn't demanded. It was enforced by consistency, by patience, by knowing when not to react. Harlem absorbed the story into its long memory. It wasn't about one insult or one arrest. It was about a line crossed in public, in front of witnesses, at a time when silence was no longer guaranteed. The word that had been used to shrink Frank ended up exposing the men who spoke it. That was the irony systems never understood. And that's what happened next. Not revenge, not chaos, just consequences. Harlem didn't need blood to make its point. It needed time. And time, when paired with truth, always collects its debt.